On behalf of the Counselors of Real Estate, welcome to Office Conversions, a means to an end. Thank you for joining us. I'm Bill McCarthy, CRE Global Chair of the Counselors of Real Estate and the President of WPJ McCarthy and Company in Burnaby, British Columbia, Canada. The Counselors of Real Estate is a distinguished international group of accomplished advisors addressing real estate challenges worldwide. Experienced, innovative, and credentialed problem solvers, counselors reside in 22 countries, practice in many more, and offer expertise in 60 real estate disciplines across all asset classes. Each has earned the prestigious CRE designation. Let's recognize our What's Next webinar series sponsors: Altus Group, Busac Real Estate, Equus Capital Partners, Ascenda School of Management, Harborview Electric, and WPJ McCarthy and Company Limited. Thank you all for your support. Before we begin, I'd like to offer you all a free subscription to the Counselor's peer-reviewed professional journal, Real Estate Issues. If you don't already subscribe, please visit cre.org/REI. You're encouraged to utilize the Q&A feature should you wish to submit a question. Your participation is welcome, and we'll answer as many questions as time allows. I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Jonathan Shine, CRE, CEO and Executive Director of Real Estate Limited Partner Institute, better known as RELP. Jonathan's platform connects real estate institutional investors, fund managers, operating companies, and organizations allied to the industry through virtual meetings and live networking events throughout North America and Europe. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you. So, thank you, Bill, and I think we'll get started. A couple of weeks ago, we had a webinar based on the same topic, office conversions. But before you can get to office conversions, we said, how do we empty out the offices before we can convert them? And we had more than 300 people registered for the webinar, as we do today, because this is a conversation that is going to continue on, not on a monthly basis, but we've got several years to work this out. And it's a great opportunity for us, the Counselors of Real Estate, who are also known for solving the world's complex real estate problems. This is a really complex one. With that, I'd like to introduce our two panelists, or I'd like them to introduce themselves, starting with our fellow CRE, Tony Delapal, who will also be our chair next year, 2024.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm happy to be on this side of the podium this time. As Jonathan indicated, I'm currently the first vice chair of the counselors, and I have a little frog in my throat today due to some social activities over the weekend where, as a 60-plus-year-old, I attended 2 back-to-back weddings and had to shout over the bands. But for those of you who don't know me in my professional life, I run a law firm in northern New Jersey that focuses on real estate valuation work and primarily eminent domain and property tax work. We have quite a bit of experience over the course of my entire career, but in particular in the past 5 or 10 years in dealing with office properties and their valuations. So my focus today will be mainly on the legal, zoning, and planning issues that these office properties and their potential conversions are presenting, and how some of the impacts are already starting to show up in the market. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks.
Thank you, Tony. It's been interesting to see how we're going to weave these two parts of the equation together. And now, Mark Ginsberg.
Thank you. I'm Mark Ginsberg, one of the founding partners of Curtis Ginsberg Architects. We do a lot of both new construction and renovation of residential buildings, largely in New York City, and also institutional governmental work. And in addition, I'm president of Citizens Housing Planning Council, which is a think tank advocacy group for housing in New York City. And I'm also a commissioner of the Landmarks Preservation Commission in New York City. And I'm supposed to add, and in no way am I speaking for the Landmarks Preservation Commission.
Okay, thank you. So we know we have a problem on our hands. And we know that probably the problem with the city with the biggest problem would be New York. But it's a big country. The Councilors Cup is a global organization. But Mark, why don't you kind of take us on a journey of what it is to convert, or at least attempt to go through the process of conversion? We all know that there's a small percentage that can actually be converted to residential, but maybe there are other uses as well.
Well, yes, and I'm going to share my screen because although I was only doing a little PowerPoint, I had more. I wanted to make one or 2 points. Older buildings like the Woolworth building, which at least on the upper floors were converted pre-World War II without fluorescent lighting. You wanted your office space to be within 30 feet of a window. Once you added fluorescent lighting, you could get buildings like the World Financial Center with much deeper floor plates. And just as a thought piece, the Empire State Building would be a very good building to convert because when you look at the floor plans, it isn't a very deep building. And in addition, and this gets to another issue, it had light and air on all sides because from the physical perspective, if you want to convert a building for residential, in most cases, any habitable rooms require windows. And that means if your building is too deep, or if you have it right at a rear property line and so you can't put in legal windows, it makes it difficult to convert it. And also, if you've got party walls where there's a building right next to you, you can't put windows there. And so conversions can get very tricky for that reason. Just something else to mention that we can talk more about is you can have loss factor issues. We just moved our office because our old building is being converted. But there is 12 feet between the 2 elevator banks, nice wide lobby and upper floors. That is going to make a very inefficient building because there's no easy way to use that space as rentable residential space. And with that, I mean, I can go on, but I think that's a start for the discussion.
Well, let's kind of, let's drill down a bit on this. And obviously it's the older cities that have some of the older buildings: New York, San Francisco, Chicago, Boston. I mean, are you saying as we go through the conversion process, you should look for buildings that were basically created before fluorescent lighting?
In the ideal world, and let me go a bit, we're in Lower Manhattan in New York City, and Lower Manhattan has had a lot of conversions for 3 reasons. In the mid-90s, this Lower Manhattan had about an 18 or 20% vacancy rate. And so the city changed the zoning and had some tax incentives to make conversions easier. Then after 9/11, there were the Liberty bonds, which made it easier to finance conversions. And so Lower Manhattan, which was totally office 30 years ago, has become a mixed community. And for example, recently a Whole Foods opened in Lower Manhattan, and the streets around the stock exchange are closed to vehicles. And in the evening, there are dog runs for people who are taking their dogs out for walks. So that worked very well. And it was a combination of financial incentives, largely not completely older buildings. The building we were in was built in 1959 and seems less good for conversions, but older buildings tend to be better. But again, you've got to then check, do they have legal windows where you can put an apartment, etc. But that makes it easier. And in New York, we have a lot of older buildings. I should add, and this isn't my area of expertise, but Ruth Culpaper, who's a member of CRE and is our broker, says the Class A buildings are doing pretty well. And it's the B and C tend to be the older buildings that have the very high vacancy rates. So I think not always, but often that is going to make sense.
Well, let's get into the tax issues. Tony, representing everything across the Hudson River. How's that?
Well, I think where I should start is by suggesting that while the problems are the same in the urban areas and the suburban areas, I think the solutions are different. We don't see as many office buildings being converted into residential. They're being either repurposed into other uses or being demolished. And that's Class A. It's not the old B and C stuff. Actually, at least in the Northeast, the older office stock that's Class B and C is doing quite well, because those spaces are more readily adaptable to cutting them up into smaller users. So smaller businesses who tend to be in the office more than the larger corporations who might have hybrid or remote work, policies that are more liberal for the employees. But it's the A buildings that we're seeing going away. I have one just a few hundred feet from my office here in Morris County, New Jersey, that's on a state highway. That was a 320,000 square foot, 2-building Class A complex that is now on the ground, and it's being replaced with a 4-story stick-built mixed-use development with retail at the ground, a hotel and apartments. So I think the first thing to look at before we can get to the property tax issues, Jonathan, is what do you do with these things and how does it work, knowing that the process to convert an office building is not something you can just snap your fingers and have it happen. There's a lot that goes into it. And as Mark has indicated, for the urban core, I don't think people are going to knock down a building. They're going to try to use it in some way. But here, and I think it's this way in all the suburban areas I've seen in the past few years, we're challenged by whether the property should stay as an office property or be used as something else. And if it's something else, we're probably not going to keep the structure up. So if you think about that just for a minute, for those of you who either live or work in suburban areas, most better offices are not in residential neighborhoods. They are in commercial neighborhoods or on highways or with access to highways where their workforce can get there. So instantly, if you're going to take an office building and try to put residential there, whether you repurpose the building or knock it down and build new, you probably have a zoning problem. And you probably have a planning problem, because most communities, at least more modern communities, were planned to have uses that integrate with each other. And most of the office stock that is most susceptible to conversion is in 20 to 40 to 50-year-old office park settings where there's no services that can be provided to the people who might live in these apartments. So that's the first thing that we're seeing and looking at. Whether you can get zoning or not to allow the residential, the market still has to accept it. It has to be suitable for residential if that's what you're going to do. So what we've seen is actually, I think there are 3 varieties here or flavors that we're seeing. One is, yes, take office down, probably in the suburbs, replace it with residential, maybe with some street level retail, maybe build a community if it's a large enough area that you can make your own community. Second, take the office property and maybe repurpose it to a different kind of office. Maybe it goes from traditional office to life science, global research, which is still healthy, at least in the suburbs. And that requires some work inside, that you hire someone like Mark to help you figure out how to put those labs in those office spaces. And then the last thing is the thing which I have seen more and more of in the past 2 years than I ever thought I would. And that is taking office sites and turning them into industrial. Most of those that we have seen are knockdowns for the buildings. And now you're putting a warehouse with heavy truck activity in an area that wasn't meant to have it. And there's a rebound effect because the communities don't want the trucks in their yards or in their neighborhoods. So some of the towns are zoning out industrial, even though the market still wants it. And that's a problem. So that's the best answer I can give you to start before we get to the taxes.
Well, but let's just talk about that for a second. What you're saying is it's NIMBYism, right? I mean, that's essentially, we know we need it, we know we want it, but now we're going to knock it down, and tax revenues will not exist if it's an empty building, right? The landlord may give it back, the developer may say, hey, here's some jingle mail, bank, you take it. So how do you, I mean, you must be on the front lines of trying to balance out that particular financial issue.
Well, yeah, sure. Just this week, we took on a new matter involving a tax appeal of a Class A office building that has an assessed value of about $35 million, and the buyer paid $8 million. It was not a liquidation sale. That was the market value. I actually have a couple of pictures of some properties that might help to tell the story here. Shay, if you're able to put up the two photos one at a time, thank you. So this one, this shows the NIMBYism. This property is in central New Jersey near Rutgers University, in a very established office park campus, just off of our Beltway, Route 287, the New York City Beltway, which comes into New Jersey. It was built in the mid-'80s. It's on 31 acres. It was 360,000 square feet of Class A space, sometimes referred to by the brokers as the best office building in central New Jersey. It was purchased in the fall of 2021 for $43 million. And the deal was not subject to any approvals. And the buyer knocked down the buildings because they had plans to build 2 warehouses totaling 430,000 square feet. To my knowledge, that project is happening, but it caused fallout in the community in that specific town. Now is considering zoning out more warehouse. So this one might have gotten in under the gun, but in the future they're not. But this is, if you think about this, is a 360,000 square foot asset that someone paid about $110 a square foot FAR for a warehouse that wasn't there. Can I see the next picture, please, too? Okay, here's another story. So this is in Charlotte, North Carolina, about 7 miles from downtown. It's a 110,000 square foot building. It looks pretty good, doesn't it? It was bought in 2016 for $35 million. Institutional buyer and seller. That's about $325 per square foot of building. Just a few months ago, within the past 3 months, I think, a closed title, bought by an institutional buyer for $15 million or $139 a square foot. It's in a very healthy office complex with a lot of amenities, parks and water ponds and commercial and all that. Both at the time of 2016 and 2023 sales, the property had a sole tenant called Walmart. They're still there. So why did it trade for less than half of the value that it had 7 years earlier? And then think about the implications on the local budget. If that property, just based upon that sale, has a property tax reduction, which may cut the rateable in half or greater. Those problems are just starting. And I think what's going to happen, at least in the suburban areas, if there is a precipitous drop in the value of the office buildings and a corresponding decrease in the property tax revenues that they generate, especially in high tax states like mine or most of the Northeast, where we do have very high property taxes, the towns aren't going to be able to meet their budgets. And they're going to have to figure out a way to solve that problem, which means that it's probably going to have to find rateable increases somewhere else, maybe in the housing community. So everyone's property taxes are going to go up because of this.
Wow. Okay. So, and
you can take that down unless you want to keep looking at it.
Did you ever find out why it went out for like less than half of what it was acquired for?
I don't know the facts. My sense is that the Walmart lease is coming up.
Okay.
And the buyer knows that, and they may not be able to fill more than 60% of the space because we're reading and seeing and interpreting the data that there's about a 30 to 40% decrease in demand nationwide for good office space. So that's probably what that means. They had 110,000 feet. They're either moving out of town and going to Arkansas, or they only want 60,000 feet now. And the buyer knows that.
So I encourage our audience of, wow, big audience. If you have any questions for these two gentlemen, please feel free to put them in our Q&A chat. So Mark, how busy are you? I mean, does your phone constantly or whatever it is, you get text?
We have not yet. I mean, we did a school to residential conversion about 10 years ago. We've been looking at a project, but we have not yet done that. And we're busy, but not with office conversions. And part of that in New York City, are there 2 or 3 things happening? The city has made a proposal called the City of Yes for a Housing Opportunity, which will make many of the changes they made it, and I could go into more detail, easier to convert in Lower Manhattan, easier to convert in the rest of the city, and particularly Midtown, where there's a lot of vacant office space. But even in the other boroughs, their central office areas, and there may be vacant buildings that would make sense to convert. That zoning proposal is in the preliminary process, and if all goes well, will be approved a year from now. And so that's the first thing. The second thing, and I could talk a little, although not my area of expertise on the tax issue, is there in New York, New York's property tax for rental residential makes it almost impossible to build. And there was a program called 421A that 2 years ago the legislature didn't renew. So now if you do an office conversion, with some exceptions, and I'm not the financial expert, you've got to do it as condos. You can't do it as rentals because it doesn't pencil out. And I just add, there was part of the governor's housing compact program last spring was to make office conversions easier. And although that may have been less controversial than other parts, none of it got passed by the legislature. So there's work the state can do. And I would add, New York City has some of the same property tax issues. As the value of office buildings go down, that is a major part of the city's taxable income, and residential tends to be less. So even if you convert it, the city is going to have financial issues too.
Not to mention, there's a lot less commuting and a lot less revenues coming from subways
Right.
and the mass transit, which, it's got to be down 40%. We do have a question from our audience. Does the panel have any reliable hard data on the actual percentage out of 100% of office buildings that are actually convertible to multifamily? And I think we kind of should break that down into what I think Tony said a little earlier. We've got this urban issue, and then we've got the suburban issue. So I'm curious about that.
I will say, and there have been some studies in New York, and the number I have heard is 10% of the office could be converted. But given that we have a 20% vacancy rate, that could really help. It would create some housing, and it would cut the vacancy rate in half, the current vacancy rate in half.
And
that's assuming the market can find a way to buy that property and make it pencil out to do the job.
Yes,
right?
I'm talking about physically able to
Yeah.
convert. And one of the other points that we haven't talked about is you've got to get people out. And just as an example, in our old office, there was a clause in our lease that said they could kick us out with a year's notice. Our new office doesn't have that clause. We didn't want it to happen again. And so it's going to depend on a lot of things.
Tony, I mean, what
I've heard the 10% too and read it. I would tend to think that it's not markedly different in the suburban office landscape. I don't know of any particular study that I've read recently, but my thinking is that there's probably something that NAIOP has put out. That's a possibility. Maybe there are some multifamily institutional, data centers that have this stuff that they're looking at. But I tend to look at this as a baseball game, and when you combine this issue with the coming wave of debt and the knowledge that there are decreased needs for space because of all the things that we've been through, which have only really just been accelerated by the pandemic. They didn't start with the pandemic. They were already happening, as we all know, that we might be in the third inning, maybe the fourth, that we're just starting to figure out how to play the game. And that those who are looking for deals are going to have to see how they work in real life. Where do you get your debt? What does it look like? Who your partners are? How does it end up costing you? How much and how long does it take? And I will tell you, unless, at least in a state like mine, which is heavily regulated, unless you've got the government on your side, you should expect that these things are going to take time because of the regulatory nightmares that they present. And a couple of the solutions that we have started to see in our state are things that may exist in other places. One is the option to include affordable housing set-asides and inclusionary projects makes the towns happy, right? So if you knew whether you're going to buy a building and rehab it or knock it down and build new, if you knew, let's say, that you could build 250 units there under a 5-story stick built with ground level retail and some structured parking, the town might give you 300 market rate units if you give them 50 or 60 affordable units too. So you'll get some density bonuses in your zoning incentives if you give the town what it needs for affordable housing. We've seen that happen. There are shopping centers where old supermarkets have been knocked down and they're under construction right now in good locations with good school systems where we have multifamily going up that will receive children that are not just age restricted, that will put more kids in the schools, which might not have room already. So there's other things for that. So that's one issue. The second is, at least in my state, we have a local redevelopment law that identifies different kinds of conditions that can constitute blight. And it's a very permissive statute that we fight about all the time, whether something can be blight or not. But if it qualifies as a redevelopment area, then the town can use eminent domain and take the property, so you don't have to worry about the occupants, as Mark said, number one. And number two, you get zoning relief in the form of contract zoning through what's called the redevelopment plan that puts that zoning that you want, that is market participant driven, into the deal. And then third and finally, we use an instrument called the payment in lieu of taxes mechanism, or pilot, where the redeveloper has a contract with the town to agree to pay a fixed property tax price over the course of up to 30 years. Instead of having to worry about what the property tax burdens may be, especially on a rental project, they have a fixed amount, and the towns like it because it's guaranteed money to them. And they get to keep more of it, at least in my state, than if it's traditional property taxes. They don't have to give a portion of it to the counties. They just get to keep almost all of it in those things. So those incentives are really important, Jonathan. And I think, the government has to be a partner here. And I'll talk a little bit about the federal government, what it's doing, but I wanted to stop there now because I think that's more than enough to answer your last question.
That fourth inning is wildly optimistic. I've heard from some of our institutional investors that I work with, we're not out of batting practice yet. So, and
Right.
And with interest rates as they are, nothing is really truly going to pencil out at this moment. But back to Mark, we have a question for you. Can you briefly run through the construction challenges, costs, obstacles for conversion, plumbing, HVAC, fire protection, biggest challenges other than windows and light?
Well, obviously it will depend on localities, although most of the country has some form of the IBC building code. Excuse me. The other thing, in New York City, we have a local law 97, which is encouraging carbon reduction. And so a number of these older buildings are going to need to replace their systems anyway. So you can argue it isn't a bad time, because if you've got an empty building, it's easier to do. You obviously need many more plumbing stacks. They tend to be smaller, but every kitchen and bathroom needs that. You're going to need mechanical ventilation for the kitchen and bathrooms. Your heating and cooling are often different systems. You don't have big centralized systems, or even if you do, each apartment is going to have its own unit if you're circulating water. And the other thing is, particularly with glass facades, is the envelopes, where if you're trying to reduce carbon footprint at the same time, a lot of the buildings still have not dual pane glass, a single glass curtain wall that was done in the 60s or 70s, probably is ready to be replaced. And so that adds a whole other cost. And if you have an older masonry building, it may not have insulation, and that adds a cost and some tricky issues with condensation and so on, which is a whole other topic. But the plus of this, and we talked when we were having initial, even if you're just keeping the superstructure, most of the embodied carbon in a building is in concrete and steel. And so even if you're reskinning the building and running all new systems, first of all, timing, you're not doing a foundation and having to build up. And second of all, from an environmental perspective, it can be much better. And even I would just add, in Anthony's description of how a lot of the suburban office buildings are just being torn down, you still have the infrastructure, the parking, the water and the sewers there, and often the site drainage controls. So there can be some real advantages to redeveloping, but it isn't cheap.
Well, we have another question. I think it's more skewed towards Tony because, you're in New York, Mark, as I am. So it's not, proximity is never particularly a big issue, but Tony, does proximity to transit make it more or less likely or desirable for office conversion? How about proximity to amenities like restaurants? Which kind of development values proximity to these things more?
So, at least prior to the beginning of the pandemic, the strong trends in the suburbs were to focus on transit-oriented development, and the government was behind it. And, it provided options for mixed-use development that had access to different kinds of transit, whether it be train or bus or ferries, as it may be. And that, I think, is still around and is happening, but most, not all, most larger office complexes, at least in traditional suburban areas, are not near mass transit. They are near highways. And I think that poses an issue for the transformation of the uses, because there are competing interests here. Let's say that you're a young professional and you want to buy or rent one of these beautiful new apartments that's going to be built on one of these properties with a lot of amenities. Unless the development is large enough to create its own place, you're going to have to get in your car and go somewhere to do whatever else you want to do, which is not what the planning goals of the suburbs have been. And that's why I think there's going to be resistance in the market until there's a way to integrate all of the things that people who live in places want and need to do. You need to be near those restaurants. You need to be, near ways to get to and from work. And it's not always in a car on a highway by yourself. So that's the problem, Jonathan. I don't see a fast solution to this. I mean, you're talking about taking some class of real estate that has developed a certain way over the course of decades, and because there's an oversupply now of it, turning it into something else. You don't just blink your eyes and make it a residential neighborhood if that's what you want. It has to become one, and there are things that have to be done to make that happen. Yeah, you've probably have sewer, you probably have water utilities and electric and all that you need, but do you want your kids, if you raise little kids, playing on a highway where the speed limit is 65 miles an hour, which was fine for an office parking lot, but not good for a playground in a nice high-end community, which is what they're building? So I do think that there are going to be a lot of hiccups in the way here, and that's why I think that the partnerships with the governments is important. There is some transit-oriented development incentive in the federal government's programs that have just been released, and I don't know if this is a good time to just maybe talk about that for a moment.
Please do.
Okay. I don't know if I can share it or not. I'll try to when I'm not talking in the chat, but about 2 weeks ago, the Biden administration released basically a press release, which announced a bunch of different incentives and programs that are available to assist essentially the housing market in trying to take over some of this glut of office space. And there's a variety of different incentives. There are monies available through the transportation agencies for transit-oriented development projects, as one example. There's money from HUD grants, $10 billion to talk about rehabilitating properties into residential anchored properties. GSA is trying to find ways where it may be able to take its office stock that it has too much of and sell it to the public for private projects. So there's some incentives in there. There's actually a guidebook, and there's a link to it in the materials I'll try to share. It's called the Commercial to Residential Federal Resources Guidebook, which talks about 20 different federal programs that are actually have the support of the government now. So it's basically a combination of loans, loan guarantees, different kinds of grants and incentives to take this animal that we've got and have the government participate in ways on a federal level that can hopefully complement what the local governments are doing with zoning and other planning efforts, and then have the private market receive it and then pick up that asset, at pennies on the dollar, let's say, so that when they know they have a very expensive proposition ahead of them, they can still have it come out ahead and make money on it. So what I'll do is when I'm not talking, I'm going to try to put that in the chat, and you let me know if everyone can see it. And if not, we'll have to distribute it after the program. But there is a really good announcement on the White House's website with links to all this material.
That's the GSA may know more than most because they can't get their own employees into the offices now as it is. So they're probably trying to move that property. But this actually touches upon a question that came in with these incentives that the federal government is offering, or at least ostensibly offering. Can you address the financial feasibility with the current interest rate environment, as well as construction material and labor costs? So is the federal government offering better incentives, better interest rates? How are they? Do you know how they're structuring this?
I don't think anyone knows yet because they haven't used it yet.
Oh,
but
okay.
The idea is to kind of bridge the gap and to get you to the point where, like in my case, in my state, those pilots, they help the projects pencil out, right? You get you to the point you have a fixed expense, you can budget it, and know you can make money. These things are intended to be complementary to what's out there in the private market and try to get you over the hump so your project can work. But I think we're in uncharted territory. A program of this size, a problem this big, with so many different implications, or at least around this country, I just don't see the end in sight. And I think there's going to be a lot of different ways in which the private market will adapt to it, and the incentives are an important part of it.
Yeah, as there'll be a lot more webinars about this from the counselors of real estate. That's how I'm viewing it. Mark, did you have something to say?
Not specifically about that, although I saw there was a question about hotel conversions.
Yes.
And I can talk most about New York City, where during the pandemic, a lot of hotels survived. Some had real problems, but survived by the city leasing them for shelters to try and get people out of congregate shelters. And the city still, with the immigrant influx, has been renting a number of hotels. And between that and the revitalization of tourism and some other factors, the city made it harder to build new hotels. I don't think the hotels are a big part of the solution. I would add, there's a long history of converting hotels to residential. And because the plumbing runs up for at least bathrooms, they tend, and they're designed for light and air, they tend to be easier to convert. But it's a limited solution.
Okay. Yeah. For some reason, something just happened with the screen. You got much bigger.
I saw that.
So anyway, you had a lot to say. There we go. We're back to normal. Okay. Another question just came in. What about converting office to hotels? Would that kind of fall into the same issue that residential falls into?
In certain ways, it's worse. Because, again, with light and air and depth, hotels tend not to be that deep. If you go into a hotel room, you've got the bathroom and the closet, and then you have the sleeping area. I mean, some are bigger and will have a kitchen or a sitting area. And so And the problem with a lot of office conversions is the offices are deep. And with residential, well, one of the things that happened in Lower Manhattan is they allowed live workspaces that didn't have a window. So you could have a small office, and that helped make it easier to convert a deep building. And that won't help you with a hotel.
So, never overlook the creativity of the real estate professional. 15 years ago in the GFC, and there was all this empty housing stock, we created a new asset class of single family rental. So you never know what the next thing will be. I mean, obviously that was a little easier, but probably, Tony, you can answer this. The zoning on that probably had to be changed as well to go from single family ownership to rentals. Maybe you could walk through that a little.
Well, in most states, I think the zoning process is a little more streamlined than it is in mine. We have a very onerous procedure,
Right.
and it's time consuming and expensive, and it involves politics, not just planning and zoning principles. So to take one use and get zoning for another one has always been a difficult proposition. You're now talking about doing it not in a little place here and there, right? Taking that gas station property that had a lot of extra land that wanted to become an office or a small retail building. You're talking about taking chunks of land, acres and acres and acres of land that have been devoted to really quiet uses. Offices are empty. Well, even before the pandemic, they were empty at night generally, and on the weekends when people are in their homes. So if you had an office park that abutted single family residential subdivision, they coexisted pretty well, right? What happens now? Especially if you need to go back to the earlier question about taking a project and providing complementary uses to the multifamily residential, making a place with a restaurant and a bar that you may or may not be able to get a liquor license for it, putting a hotel in, right? Next to housing, I'm not sure it works. And that's what we saw and have seen with respect to these conversions from office to warehouse, that the neighborhoods where the office properties predominantly existed were not readily adaptable to truck traffic, heavy truck traffic for warehouses. So there's going to be pushback, I think, in most communities where they have active zoning. And that solution is not an easy one, because not only does the development or redevelopment of a former office property into residential or industrial require potential zoning and planning assistance, for lack of a better word, it requires other reactionary infrastructure items, right? I mentioned earlier the schools. What if you bring in new residents and now your schools are overburdened? You got to build new schools, right? What if you need to increase your fire, police services, your emergency services, because there's a lot of new people there, living there. Especially now you go to age restricted, right? Which we have a lot of here. You use age restricted as a carrot to dangle in front of the governing body because it won't burden the schools. But then the continuing care providers come in and build the independent living to assisted living facilities where they need more ambulances, right? And they're going to burden the healthcare system that way. So I do think that this has to evolve organically, like the original development of those areas did, and that there's going to have to be some give and take by the private sector and the government agencies in question, knowing that at least in the suburban areas, small towns are small towns, and they want to stay small towns. They don't want to become big cities. So that is a clash that I see already starting to happen in some of the communities around here.
All right. So another question, or a comment in question. Someone remembers that Fannie Mae, there was a Fannie Mae program called Transit-Oriented Mortgage to encourage purchases primarily to homeowners to purchase in areas where public transit was readily available, therefore eliminating the need for a car and associated expenses. Tony, this is for you. Does the program that you were talking about mirror that in any way, or is there any push for such a thing? It would certainly help with the office to condo conversions, unless this type of financing would work with the developer of the proposed conversion office. So
I believe that there is, in the newly released press release, there's nothing that is newly issued by Fannie Mae. I see DOT, HUD, GSA. I've seen the National Association of Counties and American Planning Association offering some incentives and relief. And also the Treasury Department has just posted a blog in the past 2 weeks, which has a list of tax incentives for multifamily redevelopment projects. So I think if the link that I sent there, if you look at that, within that article, there are links to all of these different programs, and that guidebook will tell us if the Fannie Mae program has been changed at all. It sounds to me like it hasn't, but it would probably apply to this problem.
So, along what you were talking about, New Jersey's somewhat Byzantine in terms of getting things done. What states out there do you know of where the process is a bit simpler?
Texas.
That's
to
it.
some degree, Florida. I think Arizona, although they seem to be catching up from what I've heard, they're getting more like some of these other states in the Northeast. But we talk about the Sun Belt and the growth in the Sun Belt area, into the Carolinas and Georgia. I think if you're looking at converting office properties in places like that, the office properties are in areas that have already been developed, right? It's not new development. So they probably don't have a markedly different physical or planning set of facts to start with. What's different is that the regulatory environment is probably a lot looser and more friendly to the developer. And you may see more action in those communities, just as you've seen more development in them, because the companies are going there building their headquarters, and that's where they want their employees to be. So I do think that will continue to buoy the market in the Sun Belt areas by taking more opportunities there than we might have here in the Northeast or in California.
And Mark, let me ask you, what do you deal with on your own as an architect? Regulatory issues? Do you have to go through certain processes? I mean, we do real estate from a finance and development and construction, but just walk us through some of the regulatory issues that an architect.
Well, there are a number, and I've talked about some of them, but in zoning is in most, and this is particular in New York City, if you have a commercial zone, it allows residential, not all, but in most, so you can convert it. However, the state limits residential FAR till 12. So unless you're in an older building, which is exempt from that, if my building is more than a 12 FAR, I've got to figure out something to do with the FAR above 12. There are often, hopefully with the changes the city is talking about, it's going to make conversions much easier for any building built for 1990. That was the date they could go to and made some sense. So hopefully that will make that part simpler. But again, as I said, it's light and air. It's environmental issues, depending on what was done in the building. That often makes manufacturing buildings harder to convert. But there, right now, there is at least conceptually a lot of support within the city administration to convert, to build housing. One of the issues that's coming up is with inclusionary, which can make a lot of sense, which requires a certain amount of affordable for the market rate and typically a bonus. If you ask for too much, it can make things not pencil out. And the problem also with that is interest rate and what people are willing to pay sensitive. So if a locality is too fine in figuring that out at one point and the numbers change, they'll get no development. I just wanted to add one other thing that I didn't mention before. It is possible in a big building to carve out a light well if the building's big enough, or in a suburban office park. And if you can do it on column lines and structurally, I'm not saying it's cheap, but that can be done. And in New York, you are allowed to take that floor area that you got rid of and stack it somewhere else if there's a way to do that. So there a number of options. They're just almost never inexpensive.
No good options, and it's just so funny just to kind of go a little hysterical. I mean, we see interest rates now at 6-7%. I mean, when we were coming into the business, interest rates were a lot higher than that, and somehow real estate happened, right? And so there's got to be a way to actually find our way through this. It's just that so many people have been used to free money, basically free money since 2008 and 9. So there are creative souls out there that are going to help us move through this. I think the biggest issue is really, as Tony, you said, we're in the 4th inning. I hear we're in batting practice. We really don't even know if the game has started yet because we don't know where this is all leading.
I would
Jonathan,
add,
oh, go ahead, Mark, go ahead.
the umpires don't have a final rule book yet to tell you what's a ball and a strike.
Right.
Yeah.
And what I was going to add is that because of the uncertainty about the cost of the debt, when you consider that with the knowledge that it's going to take time to get these projects to happen, even in an easy regulatory environment, there's so much to be done in the buildings themselves, as Mark can tell you, and it takes time. How can you project out what it's going to look like when you're done, and where your debt service is going to be, and what your rents or sale prices might be? We don't have a lot of confidence in the market from what we can see right now, just because there's a pause. People are waiting to see, and that means that why would you take the bull by the horns on a tough project just because there's property available, right? Eventually they will, because there'll be a combination of forces. The prices will go low enough. The free money won't necessarily come back, but these incentives may make it more free than it otherwise would be. And then people are going to start doing it, and then you'll see if it works, right?
And at the same time, office occupancy could go down up again as new businesses are created, and they need to fill this space. But we'll see what kind of businesses they are. So, Mark, are you seeing from the other perspective on the office side? Are you getting busier in any way?
Well, we've been quite busy. A lot of our practice is affordable housing, which is kept going. And I've talked to some other firms where they see a slowdown. But the AIA, American Institute of Architects, publishes the Architectural Billing Index every month. I and many other architects every month get a survey and fill it out. And magically it becomes, if it's above 50, that means there's growth. And if it's below 50, it means things are contracting. Up till about 2 months ago, it had been above 50 for 18 months, 2 years. It just went below 50 a few months ago. So I think there is some slowdown coming. How much, how big is hard to say.
This webinar keeps just getting better and better. My goodness. So, Tony, are you seeing a slowdown in what or speeding up in some of this conversion process? Are you seeing more applications?
I don't see a lot of new activity in the past 18 months. The projects that are underway, but what is happening, at least from our perspective, is that the deals that are happening out there are deals that have some kind of sweetener in them. Whether it be some federal grant or some other incentive. I mean, Mark works in the affordable housing space, and, he knows that there are tax incentives available, tax credits and things for 100% affordable projects, but that's a completely different user, a developer, than someone who does an inclusionary project. So I do think there's going to be a lot more pain points, both in the repurposing of the properties and the sale of the properties as the debt comes due with less people in them. And it's going to take time. We still haven't figured out how to do office in 2023, because everybody's got their own opinion. It probably is going to take another 3 to 10 years before we reach an equilibrium, right? So while that part of the market is adapting, it could be that we have a little less inventory available than we do today, or we could have a lot more. And that's a thing that I think, we're just gonna have to wait and see and watch. And The supply that's available today is abundant. It's going to probably in the short run get bigger, but it may not continue to expand in the long run. We just don't know.
Probably won't see a lot of new office construction right now. That's my guess, at least certainly not in the Northeast, maybe in some of those cities, town and states that you were talking about. So we are starting to wind down. Do you have any final comments on where, our audience should start, what they should think about, not what they should do, but what kind of questions they should be asking right now? Mark.
Well, if you have a building that you're thinking about converting, it's good to talk to an architect. Doesn't have to be me, and just to figure out, is it a good candidate? Does it meet? We've looked at one building where we asked lots of questions to see if we could meet the light and air requirements. As it turns out, we probably can. But on any specific building, some are very obvious, but if you're thinking about it, doing the due diligence. One other thing I'd say, which ties into stuff that Anthony said, the building that we were in, from when they signed a contract to when they closed was a year. They now have at least 18 months of construction. So from when they said, hey, this seems like a good deal, till they could start renting, selling units is 2.5 years. And that means you've got to predict the market 2.5 years hence. But I think if you're thoughtful, and if you've got a building that's empty, you should see if it makes any sense to convert it, because if it's empty, it's not earning any income now. But,
Okay. And tell me, what questions should some of our audience be asking?
I tend to look at it this way. I think there's two overriding questions that need to be answered in any opportunity like this. First is, does the long-term prospect of the project make sense? In other words, do you want to take, in a suburban area, you want to take what was an office building down and build apartments if it doesn't work as an apartment site for demographic reasons, right? There have to be reasons why the real estate product that you want to deliver makes sense in that location. And then hopefully the price makes sense. So that's number one. The second thing is, and gets back to what Mark just said, in addition to your long-term plan, I think you need to figure out how to make it work on a short-term basis. Because if you're saddled with no income or a greatly reduced income stream, a higher cost of debt, you may never get to the finish line. You may have to hand the keys back before you even get there, because you may run into these regulatory legal hurdles. Someone might challenge your conversion when you get your approvals from the town, even though the mayor likes it. The neighbors may challenge you're going to be in court for 3 to 5 years. So can you last it out? Is there an interim plan to make sure it works? Because I think you should expect that these are not going to be overnight successes.
Great. Okay, I think we are winding down. I think, Bill, welcome back.
Well, thank you very, very much, Jonathan, Tony, and Mark. That was an excellent presentation. You've given a very much topical topic, much needed perspectives and timelines. This is indeed a topic in need of perspective, reflection, and due diligence analytics. So we thank you very, very much. Please look forward for announcements on upcoming webinars. Until then, on behalf of the Counselors of Real Estate, thank you for attending this session of What's Next for Real Estate and the Life Experience. Enjoy the rest of your day. And once again, panelists, thank you.